Are we live? All right, we're good. Welcome, everybody. This episode of Red Scared, like all of them, is going to be a little bit of a different one. Like most episodes, I've brought on a guest today. But today, once again, instead of talking about specifically the absolute tirade / fiasco that is the shitty state of American politics, we're going to be switching pace a little bit. We're going to be talking about Canada and the United States a little bit, but this topic is much broader than the concept of than the borders that we've set up for ourselves arbitrarily. Basically, as I'm very poorly trying to put it, today's topic we will be discussing an issue that is very near and dear to the soul of the country that I live in a fucked up sense. We are going to be talking about the struggles of the Indigenous people. We are going to be discussing the land back movement in particular. Now, it's no secret to anybody that land back is a very popular movement that has gained a lot of attention in recent years pertaining to Indigenous solidarity and sovereignty and, empowerment. However, as much as people on the left claim to stand for Indigenous issues, it is very clear, to me at least, that, well, unfortunately, a lot of people on the left just don't properly understand Indigenous issues as much as we claim to stand for them and be their allies. It's a little bit disheartening, especially when I see people who I thought I could call comrades, on social media and stuff like that, constantly talking bad about the land back movement. See, there exists a conflict between Native American activists who are leftists and white Western leftists. There's this disconnect that basically hinders progress. And I want to work to try to be one of the many, many, many people trying to bring down this barrier. It all comes down to misunderstanding and a lack of knowledge on Indigenous cultures and Indigenous people and what the land back movement is truly about. The land back movement conflicting with leftist ideology is the issue of that is a little bit overblown, and a lot of it is shrouded in obscurity. Well, not obscurity, in misunderstanding. So I brought somebody on the show with me today to help clear all this up, to help talk about this, because so much do I see so-called leftists talking online about land back and Indigenous people, but rarely do I see them talking to Indigenous people. Instead of asking all these arbitrary questions about the land back movement and Indigenous sovereignty and what it means for leftist ideology and stuff like that, we should just get right to the point, cut out the middleman, nip it in the bud, and talk to the Indigenous people. We can't build a revolutionary movement, united front against the bourgeoisie without sitting down with and talking with the marginalized, the people who are victims of the ruling class just as much as the rest of us are. In fact, in some ways, they're even more victims of the ruling class's tyranny than the rest of us are. The Indigenous people of the Western world and the world in general are probably the only thing standing between capitalism and complete and total environmental collapse, which we're going to get that point anyway. It's why the Indigenous people have been persecuted across North America so viciously, because their culture and their practices and their society in general and what it's built on, the foundation of their civilizations, conflicted with Western civilizations. It conflicted with the bottom line. It conflicted with profit. It conflicted with exploitation. It conflicted with bigotry. It conflicted with all of the things that the West used to found itself on. And that is why today, our governments and the ruling class that controls them still to this day do everything in their power to destabilize, destroy, and oppress the Indigenous people. So, without further ado, without, me just blabbing up a storm in this intro, I would like to introduce you to my guest, Michelle, straight out of Calgary. How you doing, Michelle?
I'm doing absolutely wonderful. Thank you for having me on your show. I so appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for agreeing to come on. It's an absolute honor. I've been meaning to talk about Indigenous issues in depth for a very long time. I just haven't found anybody that I could talk about it with, because I could just be like all those other people that just talk about it after they do their own research. But it's good to have someone who is part of that movement, part of that community, to just ask these questions to and not have to like speculate about anything. So, very quickly, tell the people who you are, where you're from, what you're about, what's your deal.
Sure. Oki, Naganago, Mekoche, Che Stokom Aki, or Dekots, Nagot Tine Sigu. My name is Red Thunder Woman. My married English name is Michelle Robinson. I use she and her pronouns. I'm speaking to you on the lands of the Niitsitapi, which is the Blackfoot Confederacy. The Blackfoot south of the imposed U.S.-Canadian border are the Blackfeet. North of the border are the Siksika, Gunai, and Bagani of the Confederacy. These lands are Treaty 7, signed in 1877, with signatures that include the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Wesley, Chiniki, and Bearspaws nations of the Stoney, and the Dene from Tsuut'ina. I always acknowledge all First Nation, Métis, Inuit, status and non-status across Turtle Island as the keepers of these lands. All non-Indigenous are treaty partners with the government signing on your behalf. Land acknowledgements are really critical for creating a safer space for Indigenous, as well as honoring the host as a guest and acknowledging our role as treaty partners in a so-called time of reconciliation here in Canada. And it's really the crux of our conversation about land back. It's important that land acknowledgements have meaning. So to all the people who are like, what did she just say? What did I just say? I just said the land I'm on. As introduced, I'm here in Calgary. Oh, that gave no history whatsoever. That gave no context about the lands that you're on. Every single person listening in North America, or what we call Turtle Island, is on Indigenous land. And I acknowledge the Indigenous land I'm on. I didn't acknowledge the colonial borders. I acknowledge the land I'm on, because those lands were stolen and genocide happened on these lands, which is really ironic in a moment of time when we're talking about genocide in the Ukraine and Russia. And ironically, the US and Canada have no leg to stand on this topic.
That is Michelle, everybody. This is the absolute amazing person that I wanted to have on my podcast today. And right out of the gate, you hit one of the nails on the head immediately. Essentially, you don't recognize the borders, the colonial borders. Nobody in the land back movement does. These borders were not created with the best interest of the people living on the land. They were created in the best interest of the ruling class. That's all they are. And it's another reason why the Indigenous people were so heavily persecuted, and in some areas of this continent, wiped out, because their very existence threatens Western civilization and the foundations that it's built on. And not for no reason either, because essentially, since the day Europeans set foot on this continent, there has been nothing but a collective effort on behalf of, white people's ancestors, and still even today, to completely turn this place into a capitalist, corporatized hellhole. Obviously, no one could have had the foresight to, just mass predict, oh yeah, this is what the future is going to look like in 100 years, 200 years, 300 years. We're going to have this system called capitalism, this system called corporatism. Everything evolves over time. But the number one thing all these eras have in common is the pursuit of profit. And Indigenous people pose a threat to that goal, which is why they are some of the most badass people that are still around today, because I'm pretty sure they have done more to resist corporate aggression and the takeover of, untouched land than any other activist has done. So, Michelle, I do have my first question to you is this. Why do you personally think that there is a rift between people who claim to fight for Indigenous issues and people who actually are Indigenous fighting for those issues? Why do you think there's a disconnect? Why do you think there's such a misunderstanding there?
Okay, point blank, it's white supremacy. Point blank. At the end of the day, even our so called allies don't understand white supremacy and haven't unpacked it. That's why anti racism training is so critical to understanding all of this because, I'm not going to sit here and talk about, just Indigenous issues without acknowledging that stolen people from Africa were forced to come here and build the country so that people who think they work hard actually are benefiting from a structure that was designed from stolen land and slaves, making infrastructure for the existing world right now. Um, so, and actually, a lot of Black folks, and Indigenous folks became lovers, and we had, babies in a dangerous time. So we actually have a lot of Black and Indigenous peoples that really are overrepresented in the justice system because, as you said, we stand up for our rights, and because of racism and white supremacy, it's so easy to throw us in jail, right? Like that idea of Lady Justice having a blindfold on is so full of shit. There's no nice way to say it,
She has a
you know?
blindfold on, but she has like 500s in her pocket.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like it's all about money and it's all about corporate interests. So like, for my people, I'm really far north. And my Dene, Satu Dene, were really mixed up with Eskimos quite a bit, even in historical context. And the Inuit were called Eskimos. It's a derogatory term, just like we're called Indians, and that's a derogatory term. And a lot of folks in the States say Native American. And so I actually think it's kind of funny. My podcast is Native Calgarian, and it literally makes fun of that because that concept is just, colonial construct. So, kind of back to your original question about, why is it people speak for Indigenous people? It is about control. It is about believing that they are somehow superior to speak for us rather than amplifying our voices. So, at times allies know this. So, like, you'll get the Leonardo DiCaprio or the Mark Ruffalo talk about an Indigenous activist doing X, Y, and Z, or even Jane Fonda will do the same. But for the most part, especially in the communist socialist movement, it's a lot of, white guys who really think that they know best to speak for us. And unfortunately, then they get it wrong. But a great way to talk about this as at a systemic way is through the United Nations. And I do this for Canadians because holy shit, the white fragility is so rampant. So the best way to talk to them about this is through the eyes of the UN. So there's two like major documents that everyone's talking about. For the Indigenous people, we talk about the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. The global Indigenous people came together and said, "Fuck you, colonizers." Put together a document that said, here's your guidelines. And the colonizers were like, oh, fuck, then they have to have control. And they said, no. So they created something called the Sustainable Development Goals. And it, ironically, if they really cared about climate change and they really cared about, sustainable development goals, then they would just implement the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People. But that would give control to Indigenous people and their inherent rights. We can't do that when you're a colonizer, when you're white, and you truly believe you're somehow superior to the Indigenous people. Like we've had terms like savage said about us. It's constant. Every day I can pick out racism on the internet. It's not a safe place for Indigenous people to be on social media and by our so-called allies. They don't retweet and amplify our voice. Well, you do, but you amplify my voice.
That's a low bar to set. It's for
Yeah,
anyone out there who's wondering. It's like that's the bare minimum you can do is amplify these people.
right. But there is like I try to share a lot of Indigenous activists that are in the States. I try to share a lot of their work too, and especially with you call them Indian boarding schools in your country, and in mine we call them Indian residential schools. So both are basically colonizers saying, "Fuck you, natives! You're not going to get your ways and culture and language anymore. You have to learn English, and you have to learn Western economy." And right back to what you're doing, let's hurt all the people, right? And that's the problem is that at a certain point people actually like drank the Kool-Aid and thought that they would somehow benefit. And like Reaganomics and Thatcherism really, gave this myth to our generation that, trickle down economics means that we'll all do great under this. And it's not the case at all. As you know, like we're having our highest amounts of death and poverty with a global pandemic without healthcare. And ironically, in Canada, you're also the myth that we have, public health care. And in some cases, we do. Like if I'm a white person and I get in a car accident in an urban setting, chances are I'm going to get good health care. But even as a native, there's a higher chance I will die in the same hospitals. And if I'm outside of the city, there's almost no hope for me whatsoever. And wait, I'm literally right now writing a speech for tomorrow because of this Roe versus Wade. Like even in Canada, we're like, oh my God, my reproductive rights. I'm like, bitches, sit down and listen to the Indian hospitals of segregation you had. We're still being sterilized against our will. Like, fuck off. We don't have access to healthcare. Fuck off. So, it's pretty, like, there's such a two-tiered system. I'm sure, like, you could say three-tiered system that's so full of shit. So, and even with your private healthcare, I mean, it's been proven that Black people and Indigenous people, don't get proper healthcare even when you have the so-called resources for it. Like, that's how deep and pervasive racism is, that even your health professionals look down on you based off the color of your skin in your most vulnerable moment, too.
Yeah, that's the thing. We forget that racism is literally everywhere, and I believe a lot of people forgot about it during COVID because everyone was panicking. The virus was everywhere, and everyone was like, "Listen to the doctors, listen to the experts, get the vaccine." Da, da, da. And while I'm not going to peddle anti-vax bullshit disinformation, I'm not a fucking Joe Roganer. I do want to emphasize the fact that a lot of Black and Indigenous people have had borderline eugenics performed on them in the last few hundred years.
Right here it was eugenics. Like in Alberta, we have the Sterilization Act that happened from the 30s until the 70s. And in Canada, we had to pass legislation. Ironically, in 1972, when Roe versus Wade became a law in 1973 in the US, like just to give you an idea. But today, there are stories in our media talking about nurses and doctors still sterilizing Indigenous women in this country.
Why does that? How does that fucking happen? It's like you go in because you broke your ankle, and then they put you under, and the doctor's like, you know what? I'm just gonna sterilize this person. How 100%. The fuck does that happen?
No, 100%. We have a class action lawsuit right now over Indian hospitals. So, because Black people couldn't be with white people, Indians couldn't be with white people. So they segregated us right away, and that they didn't even have licensed professionals doing this work. And actually, a lot of the vaccines, a lot of the vitamins, the food guides, those were all experiments done on Indigenous kids in Indian residential schools or boarding schools. So they legitimately try to figure out what is the bare minimum we can give a human being before they die. So eugenics has been performed on us for white people since the beginning of contact.
God, it's fucking egregious.
You're welcome.
No, I do appreciate.
This is where we do the suicide crisis line. If these conversations are too hard, please reach out.
I do want to very quickly say something about that, and I've been saying this for a long time because there are people out there who are like, "Oh my God, this is so horrific and depressing to hear about." And with all due respect, while I am, I'm not going to invalidate anybody whose day is ruined by hearing about this stuff. Shut the fuck up. You do need to hear it because these people have been through hell and back. If they had to experience it, the least we can do is listen to it so we can solve these problems. The horror that we think we go through when we hear about this shit, nothing compared to what they've been through. So basically, you were going something there when you said the leaders of the Western communist movements, they think they know everything about, we know how to fight for Indigenous people, when in reality, it's like, no, you still got a lot of work to do and shit like that. What I think the main problem is that we had socialists across the world have had a lot of leaders that they look up to who wrote political theory, who wrote down how to reorganize society and transition from capitalism to socialism to communism, X, Y, and Z. You got your Lenins, you got your Stalins, your Trotskys, your Che Guevaras, your Castros, your Ho Chi Minhs, your Mao Zedongs. You got your everyone who may be obscure, like Thomas Sankara. You've got just think of any prominent socialist leaders, and they write down these theories for how to organize societies. Now, a lot of socialists and communists, they do stick to doctrine, but they're willing to bend the rules depending on where they are and what fits the needs of the country. For example, you're not going to see Soviet communism being practiced in Cuba, and you're not going to see Cuban communism being practiced in China. It's depending on where it is. Now, a lot of ones say in Canada, they'll say stuff like, okay, we need a general strike. We need to seize the means of production. Workers can democratically control their industries. And then those union representatives are elected to parliament, and we throw out all the old MPs and we have new MPs who are all who are all workers representatives and stuff like that, and basically subverting the state. However, when Indigenous activists talk about what they want, which is basically like, we want our land back, we want control and sovereignty and stuff like that, a lot of these Reds will go, oh my God, no, because that conflicts with our way of destroying the ruling class. That conflicts with our workers' democracy. That's not democratic. I don't want to be led by a chief. I want to elect my leaders. I don't want to have to consider the life of a tree. I need my factory to produce this to meet these quotas and whatever. I've seen this jargon all over the place. And I know for a fact that they're either making shit up or they're blowing shit out of proportion. Because if you really research Marxist history and Marxist thought, a lot of Marx's ideas and Engels's ideas and the socialists of the old days, like the old days, a lot of their morals and their ideas were inspired by indigenous civilizations, by indigenous peoples, indigenous teachings, and all that stuff. And those are the roots of the principles of communism. A lot of communists will say, oh, we're not moralists. We're just trying to create good, efficient, ethical human societies. And I'm like, you are moralists because you're advocating for ethics. You're advocating that we change our society to be more ethical. So you can't say we're not moralistic, and you cannot deny the indigenous root in all our thought. You can't just accuse the indigenous people of being too moralistic and then be a Marxist. Okay? That's not how this shit works. So essentially that's what I've seen. And I want to ask you directly, what is the land back movement's goal? What kind of society are we talking about if we finally get our society of the natives can get their land back? And does that really conflict with what Western leftists want in terms of their workers' state where the workers have democratic control? Please explain to me.
Okay, first let's break down the concept of these workers. So here in Canada, we have what's called the New Democrat Party, and they're supposed to be for the workers. And a lot of the unions and such back them. But at the end of the day, because of white supremacy, they'll happily create, arms for the military industrial complex for jobs, because that's all they want is a job. And knowing that those pieces, those armaments will go overseas and kill brown people, really, right? Like, there's no nice way to say it. Mining companies will come for the workers and just destroy indigenous land and indigenous peoples and cultures and kill women left, right, and center. But the workers wanted that, right? So I already have a conflict with that, because at the end of the day, if workers are working for a corporation to make money, then we're serving nobody, right? Like, there has to be an understanding that you're still working for a corporate interest. Yeah, so we had economy before non-indigenous came here, and we would trade, and those rivers were our road system. We were not savage the way that people think. We had existing laws, we had existing justice, and we had existing commerce. So, for example, the Blackfoot here would be covered in some shells, and that was because they traded buffalo, whether it was skin, meat, whatever, with some of the West Coast folks who had traded shells, fish for us to have, right? Like that commerce was constantly going. But when when folks got here from other worlds, they immediately came here to exploit the land, like to exploit the resources, and then had the audacity to say we don't know how to use it. We knew how to use it just fine. We just didn't do it the way they think we should, right?
Yeah.
And they had the goal to make a queen richer or a king richer, not because they cared about the people. um, I know the Mayflower, so I'm a descendant of the Mayflower through my father, and the concept that, oh, they were escaping religious persecution, it's such bullshit, because they came here and then they forced their religion on us. So, like, I constantly tell people, because you'll hear Christians say, "Oh, the gay agenda," and I start laughing because I'm like, "You literally brought the straight agenda here. So what are you talking about?"
Yeah.
Right? Like they talk about wanting freedom, but they were the ones who brought the oppression, right?
Yeah.
In order to steal that land. So like, there's nothing that I hear come from English Canada, the U.S., Britain, that isn't hypocrisy. Like
Right.
there's nothing that comes there. So even the idea of a worker, you know, who are you working for? Because if you legitimately just want a small bit of land and want to be able to feed your family, then that, with the resources were here. Like, especially Christians talk about the Garden of Eden. We literally had the Garden of Eden until they came here and wrecked the joint, you know,
Yeah.
and then
Except
started.
y'all weren't tempted. Y'all were just like had guns pointed at you and be like,
Yeah,
"This is ours now."
yeah. Like it's so incredible the amount of hypocrisy that comes with folks who they don't even know they're siding on the side of white supremacy, right? They're
Yeah, because
so,
it's ingrained into us.
it's ingrained in all of us. And even for me, like when we talk about decolonizing, it's decolonizing that thinking. So
Yeah.
here I am, a straight cis woman, talking about the straight agenda. Why? Because we, even in our language, we didn't use this she and he. We just said they and them. That was just normalized language. We had to invent genders in order to work with the new world of people that came here. So
God,
it's
that's
it's
so
all
funny.
bullshit. It's all bullshit. So decolonizing that thinking, like that is a big deal. So land back. I mean, we're talking about getting our land language, our culture back, and going back to ways that were working, and they're not old ways. That a lot of people are still doing this work right now. So for example, like if you go in your world, they're reservations, in our world they're reserves, and if you go onto those places, there is a lot of poverty, but there's poverty because we were forced to not leave the borders. If we were allowed to go beyond the borders, we would have the resources that we need in order to live sustainably. But it's not just that. It's the governments have laws that don't allow us to develop like you would be able to anywhere outside our borders. There's so many injustices and levels of policy oppression that's why it's such an impossibility for non-indigenous to consider that we could have lived peacefully way better together. And we actually had one of the more eastern tribes, they had something called a wampum belt. And when they made treaty, there was a wampum belt given as an exchange, and the idea was to live equally together. And that has never happened since newcomers have come here. We call them settlers. I really offended someone yesterday by calling them a settler. And it's like, and it's ironic because I've been living under the Indian Act since the 1800s. I've been called an Indian when that's not who I am, and that's like embedded in your U.S. Constitution, in our Canadian Constitution. Like it's embedded in our legal framework. So literally, both countries are founded on racism. Both.
Essentially, when I hear leftists talk about revolution in Canada, one of their main things is like, oh, the reason why indigenous land is destroyed for the sake of profit. It's because, we have CEOs, we have all these like people at the top making all these decisions. they're the ones who are unethical, because they're like, well, their whole way of thinking is like, the majority of working people are good people. They're just manipulated by the ruling class, and their logic is, if workers seize the means of production and democratically decided, where to go for what to do and this and this and that, because average Joes can't be horrible people, their logic is, if it's controlled by the working people, then indigenous people won't be hurt. But I have my doubts in that, because white supremacy is ingrained into us. And I do think that, while I would prefer if I had control over my own business, but I like, collectively as workers, not someone at the top telling us what to do and taking our money and taking our, our surplus value. But without anti-racism training, these people are just going to make the same mistakes. We could have our revolution
100%.
and overthrow the government and elect
Yep.
union representatives instead of MPs. But if we don't have these conversations with indigenous people, if we don't talk about the history, if we don't talk these things over and address, the very things we've been manipulated into believing and thinking, and, the very same mistakes that our forefathers made, not mistakes, it was intentional, we run the risk of just completely betraying what the revolution stands for. And leftists get mad at me when I talk about this stuff, but there have been people who've betrayed the causes of the revolution, right? There have been counter-revolutionaries. There have been people who've just, fucked over what their revolution stood for in the first place. Like, I'll give an example. China, right? China overthrew the nationalist government, after the Civil War ended, and they created the People's Republic of China. Now, if you go back and you look at propaganda posters and you look at people talking about the Chinese Revolution, workers' representatives and party representatives, they'll say stuff like, the revolution was for everyone. We created a China for all Chinese citizens. And that's just simply not the case, because there were people who fought for the Chinese Revolution who were then persecuted by that same government, not for being fascist or right-wing or counter-revolutionaries, for being gay or transgender, or being someone who wanted a little more sovereignty in Tibet, or for being Muslim. China's government, a government that is supposed to represent the people, unfortunately continues to exclude a lot of people. And
Yes.
we cannot continue to make those same mistakes. It's very much, because a lot of leftists, they'll make this shit up. It's like they're scared that, like, oh, we give the natives control, then everything is just going to go back to how it was in the 1400s. They think, technologically speaking, and we're just going to tear down entire cities and tear down neighborhoods and shit like that. And I know it's not true. I know the indigenous people have very good points to make. When they talk about the river trading system that you just told me, a lot of these morons will think, oh, you see, we have boats and planes and shit, but they just want to use rivers and crates to deliver stuff. No, you idiot. It's about an ethical way of trading. It's about an ethical way of delivering resources. No one's talking about going back to using rivers and crates and shit. They're just about doing things more ethically. And like I said, the foundation for socialist revolutionaries and their theory is just supposed to be, it's democracy. It's more democratic than this corporate aristocracy that we're living in. But how can we turn around and call the indigenous people's ways and cultures non-democratic when Marxist theory was derived from indigenous teachings and indigenous beliefs that founded these things? There may be some small differences, but that's just because it was founded on the opposite side of the world. I want to know. I know this is a bit of a loaded question to ask, because there are leftists who want to hear indigenous people talk and clarify what the land back movement is. So I'm just going to ask you, what would a socialist Canada that also takes into account the interests of the land back movement look like? What would that lead to?
Okay, so for example, I live in Alberta, so that would be like a state in the States. And the majority of it is crown land. And then So if you were to simply just give the land back to the indigenous community, rather than it being crown land, would be indigenous run. So rather than going through this corporate bureaucracy that really fills the pockets of the queen, it would actually go back to the people. So we're in imposed poverty on purpose. We don't get revenue sharing. So we could actually do revenue sharing with the people. Imagine that. Imagine us having control of our land again. Like it's so easy because the majority of the land is not owned by the people. It is literally owned by the government. And it's not much different in the States how much government control there is over land. So these laws and policies that have been developed, they could easily be changed so that way, rather than the majority of people getting nothing, that this revenue is shared. Like that's the fundamentalism of socialism. Like it's about revenue sharing. and
Yeah.
and it's so wild to me that as US Canadian workers, that we just cannot wrap our brain around that. I mean, we should absolutely, if we can give the amount of military aid to Ukraine, why in the hell don't you have universal health care? Like, it's insane to me. it,
Yeah.
it is insane that that money can be brought up in a second, but not for things that help the people, like education. Most folks don't have education, right? They have a small bit of corporate interest curriculum to help them become effective workers for the corporation. Well, if you unpack that and gave people proper curriculum, could just imagine how you could actually work your own land in a sustainable way. The
Yeah.
solutions are there. And that's the same thing with indigenous, with non-indigenous. The solutions are there. They've been there for decades. But it's just that it's ignored on purpose.
Yeah, the parallels that run between what socialists want and what the indigenous people want, they're there in plain sight. But
Yeah.
there are still fears that are present because, they're too scared to have these conversations. A lot of them, I think, they confuse like giving land back to indigenous people with indigenous rule. They're scared that instead of everything being run by a bunch of representatives, because they don't understand indigenous culture and indigenous practices, they think that everyone, say in the province of Alberta, they're like, oh, Alberta has been given back to the indigenous people. These people are scared that instead of workers collectively making decisions as to like, this much money goes back to the people, this much goes towards making sure we have good maintenance and stuff like that. They're scared that all of that is just going to be made by decisions like that, just going to be made by a few chiefs that, in their opinion, don't represent the people. But
Yeah,
and
and that within itself is its own racism. Like, you
yeah,
you're just
it is.
explaining racism and how that these are racist beliefs based in
They are.
ignorance and white supremacy. And that's the problem. Like, if I were to go over to Rome, I have to be in accordance with their laws.
With Roman
Like,
law. Yeah.
why is it so difficult for folks to understand that our laws were meant to work? And we didn't have punitive justice system the way that white people do. We literally had education. Like, if you did something wrong, it was about educating them. Like, how could you have done this? And as a collective, it is your role to help people, so that if one person's starving, you're all starving. It's not, one person's fat living in a big fat teepee. Like, it's not
Yeah.
like that. It's we're all eating together. We're all there's another treaty called the One Dish and One Spoon, and it is about greed, where if you have more than one dish and one spoon and you're not sharing, you're being greedy. Like,
Yeah.
these are fundamental teachings that indigenous have, that supposedly Christians have, but have never ever showed us in the history of their existence here, them actually living that way, right? Like, it's all about greed. It's
It
all about
is.
corporate greed. It's all about exploitation. It's all about murdering, genocide. You know, at no point in time have Christians ever showed the very values they claim to have.
Yeah. They never have. They never have, and it persists to this very day. And what I want to know more than anything is, well, once again, we're going back to this same question, but I really want to know because it would help clear a lot of air. What let's use Alberta as an example again, right? Let's think of this as a post-revolutionary Canada where the bourgeoisie has been kicked out and parliament is filled with people who are genuinely like representing the people from their districts. However many seats have to be like changed or added or subtracted, I'm not aware.
I'm gonna stop right there, and this
Okay.
is why. So, for folks who don't know, I've been involved federally, provincially, and municipally in colonial politics. So, I've ran.
Okay.
I'm the first First Nation woman to run for the city of Calgary. I'm currently helping a woman who's running for the provincial parties, and I'm also been embedded in the federal politics. Our prime minister, like in his party, I've been doing this work.
Yeah.
So, geez, what were you talking about? You're talking about, having representatives of the people, and that's not how it is going to work until people, deconstruct their patriarchal thinking
Yeah.
and their racism.
Yeah.
Because instead of it just being, Justin Trudeau, it'll be an equally problematic person in that position
Yeah.
because they haven't deconstructed what their thoughts and opinions are, and they haven't deconstructed a different way of life, right? Like, you have to really look at our democracy and realize that it's wrong. I just watched the last Purge last night, and it talked about white supremacy. It, like, that was the whole theme of it, was white supremacy. And even when white people were turning on white people, right? And in concept, that would be the workers overthrowing the ruling class. But it so clearly wasn't happening, and because white people are so afraid of natives and brown people, like it just ended up being not helping white people in any capacity, right? And there were two main white people that ended up being like the main characters, but that bigger picture that it was natives who helped them cross back into Mexico because it was safer in Mexico than it was in the States. And if people understood, like, we are trying to work with you, not against you, and white people have it ingrained in their head that natives would work against us, and that is white supremacy thinking. That's that corporate thinking, right? We're never going to get new people in government with the current status quo. So, like, you literally have to start with education. You have to start with that curriculum. You need parents that are decolonizing their
Yeah.
thinking, teaching your
Yeah.
kids. Like,
Yeah.
we have a lot of work to do before we could just change the government system, and if
Right.
we're serious.
Well,
But we're
or keep in mind, like when I reference Parliament, when I reference like something that an ideal scenario that some people would call, we're not talking about like a conventional party winning an election and seizing power in Canada. I'm talking about a revolutionary like group overthrowing the ruling class of Canada and kicking out all the MPs who are represented by corporate interests and replacing them with representatives from the now worker controlled industries. Now, that I know isn't like, it's not exactly like universally accepted in Canada as what a socialist Canada would look like a really red Canada, but it's more, I'm trying to generalize here, right?
sure.
So you're saying that would not function properly without deconstruction of socially ingrained racism within
Yeah,
Canadians. You
so,
would
like,
not.
even for you and your people right now, like right now the Black Lives Matter movement is so real, right? Like,
Mhm.
it's happening. That revolution is happening, but white people are too afraid of it. And that is the problem. Like, to me, during COVID, it was so painfully clear how many Black people were in the streets talking about equal rights. And ultimately, isn't that what a worker wants? But if a worker is scared of the Black Lives Matter movement, then what that means is that they're afraid of change, and it's actually their racism that's stopping that change. So if your listeners and the workers out there understood that their racism is the reason why a revolution isn't happening, like, that's the problem,
Yeah.
right? That's right there.
A lot of people have likened the land back movement to movements of like older societies of like when large groups of people have been forced out of their home, and then at some point there's a big conflict to try to restore some control to that region. And instead of that, because those eras were like long ago and completely removed from the context of modern indigenous struggles, because they mostly take place in Europe or in lands that the Romans tried to conquer and stuff like that. Instead, let's focus on, let's say, a modern example is Palestine, right? Palestinian activists are often labeled as extremists. They're labeled as just, oh, they call it, they people don't want to acknowledge that they are right, that the state of Israel is just, genociding the Palestinian people through Western interests. And they think, oh, because they want to reestablish Palestine, that means they will kick out literally all of the Jewish people that live in Palestine. But that's not true, because the people behind these movements, and this includes indigenous people, the people behind these movements are not stupid. They're not ignorant to the fact that the world has changed. It's not, nothing is going to turn back the clock and stop the colonization or undo the colonization. That's not going to happen. What they want is a better world, both for themselves and the people that still live there. But in terms of the people that were moved there, like settlers, being able to do their part of that involves deconstructing what you already think, what you already know, and listening to those people. And that doesn't mean surrendering any sort of opinion you may have in regards to how to make the world better. If you're a white person that wants to take down the ruling class versus an indigenous person who wants to take down the ruling class, if you're a white person who wants control, like over society democratically, versus an indigenous person who wants control over society democratically, there's no difference between your interests. And it's unfortunately the racism that is ingrained in us at birth that keeps us from seeing eye to eye on these issues. People keep thinking, like, I've seen people make the worst takes on land back where they think that it's just, they think it's everything that I told you before, but it's not that at all. And in fact, because the indigenous people have been working there of basically putting themselves between the environment and corporatism, they're more valuable to any revolution in the West than we realize. And it's time a lot of Canadian leftists actually acknowledged that. So I wanted to ask you, what do you want to say to people who know about land back, who are aware that indigenous people should have, like, their land back, but they're unsure of how to change up their ways of thinking? What do you have to say to white Western leftists who want to make these changes but are unsure how?
Well, I truly think the land is like Indigenous 101. Like that's the whole concept of it, right? So um, if they don't know the land they're on, like if they don't know the partnering Indigenous people. So for example, if you're in Cherokee territory, get to know your local Cherokee people and join their struggles, because their struggle is your struggle. Like, and it's back to that workers' rights. Like if you're right beside these Indigenous reserves or reservations, those are your people that you should be promoting and helping and starting that revolution with, because they're the change makers in your local area, right? Like there's over 600 nations in Canada, um, and most Canadians don't know the land that they're on, let alone the history of the people around them, let alone the history of the nations around them. So to me, like if you can't pronounce the names of the nations that you're around, then I know you're not safe. I know you haven't done any anti-racism work or Indigenous understanding or land back. So like it's really important that you say your story of origin. Whether it's stolen lands, whether it's whatever your role in reconciliation is. So like, where are you exactly?
Where am I exactly?
Yeah,
It's kind of difficult because I'm bounced between places a lot, but well,
sure,
in terms of here and Toronto, but I'm going to live in Toronto soon, but
sure.
I'm currently in Barrie, or Innisfil, Barrie. Some
Sure,
people put
sure.
Innisfil before Barrie. It's that.
Sure, greater Toronto area, right? So like
Yeah.
that area there, it has so much rich history about the Haudenosaunee. I can't say it properly because I don't know their people, and I know that that land has the Edition One Spoon Treaty, right? So those are the people you want to team up with when talking about political revolution, because that's where the laws of the land will come from when and if we get our land back.
Yeah.
But that bigger picture of, like, what is your story of origin? I can say, my on my one side is I've been Dene for thousands of years since time immemorial, but for the other one, I can talk about the Mayflower and being a daughter of the American Revolution, right? And talking about the evolution of my white family's settler roots, right? So, and for folks who are black, are they, did they pay for their immigration story or were they slaves? Like I want to know your history because, especially in Canada, we if we say no, where are you really from? Everybody gets offended by that. But ironically, as an Indigenous person, I know how safe you are to be around, whether or not you can really say that. If you're acknowledging your story of origin, you acknowledge stolen lands, imposed economic oppression, your role in reconciliation, I determine how safe you are to be around for my family, my community, myself.
Yeah.
And like this is like the fundamentals of Indigenous 101, right? So that land back and being able to do meaningful land acknowledgements, not just I want to acknowledge that we're on the traditional territory of, because we seen one today at the Indigenous Twitter. We actually made fun of this one because it was like, we just want to live, laugh, and love on traditional
Ah,
right? Oh yeah, no, totally white woman that. And I was
come
laughing because I'm like,
on.
somebody made a committee to make that shitty land acknowledgement, right? Like
Somebody did. Wait, what account was this?
it was somewhere in Vancouver that had done it actually. So I had retweeted it. So you can see it on my Twitter right now. But
Let me
you
see
know,
this. Let me
yeah,
see this.
no, it's so ridiculous. But this is the type of bullshittery of land acknowledgments because people don't really want to acknowledge like colonialism, oppression dynamics, broken treaties, and they just perpetuate the lies that they were taught in Canadian schools nationally, right? So like the language people use really shows me what they know about Indigenous issues. So
I
these
can't
are
seem to
really,
find it at the moment, but
yeah,
my
I'll send
God,
it to you during private message. It's pretty funny. But
yeah, do that.
it's just another example though of how ridiculous like some of these folks understanding of indigenous community around them that they're on. Like there's an app that you just will say what land am I on, and they'll say what city are you from, and you'll say Calgary, Alberta, and it'll give you basically what I said for treaty acknowledgement.
Can you tell me the
And
name of the app?
no, if you Google it, you'll find it. I tell this on my podcast all the
Okay,
time.
no
So
problem.
yeah,
I'll
you'll
look
find
for it.
it. That's not a
Yeah.
problem. But
Um.
that's the kind of the bigger point, right? Like, is that in school you're taught about how wonderful John A. Macdonald was, and when really he was a genocidal maniac. And then in
Yeah.
so-called progressives, you're taught about the famous 5 women who got the right to vote. But what they don't tell you was right here in Calgary in 1917, there was an alleged sex worker who was Métis named Lizzie Sear. And the whole right to vote for white women was based off of her persecution of not being a person and white women being acknowledged as white women. So that's why like this whole Roe versus Wade is so ridiculous. We didn't even get the right to vote until the 60s, right? So
That blows my mind. They don't teach us this shit in
nope,
school. I
nope.
remember writing a report about Sir John A. Macdonald in grade 3, I believe. I can't remember which grade. I never knew how much. That's the thing. I wondered why history was so boring growing up in elementary schools. And then when I become older, I'm like, I know why history's boring because they leave out like 90% of it. It's like, I just thought John A. Macdonald at the time was a funny guy in a wig, or not a wig, but like funny hair. And he said, hey,
Yeah.
let's make Canada. Now that I'm older, I'm like, holy shit, how did you even get to office? But it's really scary to learn about all this stuff. And then you're taught about Louis Riel when you're in high school. I was taught about Louis Riel in First Nations class when I was in high school. And I read about this larger than life guy that had the balls to stand up to the Canadian government twice and lead 2 insurrections against the Canadian government. And he came so close at so many points. And he was executed by Sir John A. Macdonald. And he was labeled as a traitor and all this shit. And now we're here in this era talking about him because he's a hero. And I heard about it and I was like, why the hell wasn't I taught about this? This is fucking amazing. Yep. This story isn't told at all because it not being told benefits certain people. And I do agree with you because land acknowledgements, it's a little bit weird because when I heard the Pope, right, the Pope apologized to the Native people of Canada for the role the Catholic Church played in the residential schools, and recently the Anglican Church did as well. You and I discussed that when we were on the Wednesday panel. But you know, you made the point that I do agree with, that if a white person says, you know, it's not a sincere apology, means nothing and stuff like that, that doesn't really matter, because what matters is that what the Native representatives wanted, they got an apology. They got an acknowledgement of the wrongdoing. Whether we perceive the apology as sincere, which some people think not, that doesn't matter, because they've taken accountability in front of the whole world, which will have ripple effects for the other people that they've oppressed. And you know, land acknowledgements work the same way. If someone gives in a land acknowledgement, say they're the head of a business or they're a politician or whatever, and someone says that's insincere, there's no way they believe that, they never do. Okay, yeah, maybe they do, maybe they don't, but that's not important, because the fact that they're doing it at all has a big impact for other Native people across Canada. However, I do still think that a lot of people just use land acknowledgements as just ways to get off scot-free. Because I remember a few times in my high school when, you know, our announcements, the morning announcements would say, "We are on Indigenous land," and they would name the tribe, who unfortunately I forgot the name of. But I remember our teacher of the Native Studies class gave us a very important lesson that day when we first started hearing the land acknowledgements, saying, keep in mind, when people make land acknowledgements, they're not always sincere. And while it is important for the people that hear them, they can have just really bad intent where they just want to paint themselves to look good and, you know, withhold accountability for anything they've done or anything they've contributed to that is harmful to Indigenous people. So, yeah, I think addressing the insincerity of land acknowledgements is important, but I don't think we should just go around and tell people to stop making land acknowledgements because some people say it insincerely. That's bad.
Yeah, no, I think that's like the fundamentals of land acknowledgements is at least they're being acknowledged for the first time. It's interesting because I do a land acknowledgement 101, which is basically Indigenous 101. And I talk about the Duke Red Sky, I think was his name, Redbird, from your area, and land acknowledgements being part of the Toronto Greater Toronto districts. And I know the impact of that is really important because it changes how you talk about Indigenous issues, right? Like it changes that oppression dynamic where, like, I can tell when people are talking about Indigenous issues and they don't understand it because they come from a place of privilege and they speak about Indigenous as lower status people. Like you can just tell in the language. So the power of a land acknowledgement is that over time you really understand what the oppression is and start using that wording, right? So
yeah, that makes total sense.
Yeah.
Let's move on to another question that I have here, and this involves treaties, right? Now, a lot of Indigenous activists that I've seen either on CBC or on social media, when they talk about treaties, they'll come to, say, a protest or a gathering or a rally and be like, this is not right what's happening to us. The government should honor this treaty that was signed in this year by our leaders, X, Y, and Z. And what a lot of people I've seen say is they've questioned it genuinely by saying, when those treaties, because when we're taught about, actually taught about treaties, these treaties were written by white people for white people to benefit white people, right? And a lot of these treaties, sometimes the tribes that they were signing the treaties with couldn't read them, and they had to have it explained to them by so-called translators, but really they're being manipulated into signing something that they would never agree with if they were able to actually read it, right?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
it's all rigged against them from the start. But some people are like, okay, but if white people made and drafted these treaties to benefit themselves and completely screw over indigenous people, why are indigenous people insisting that we abide by treaties that were written by white colonists? Why don't we just burn all the treaties and start from scratch? So could you fill us in on that a little bit?
Yeah, this is kind of back to my land acknowledgement training 101. And, when treaty, or the intention of treaty was spiritual and ceremonial. And whether or not Canadians, have it written down, what was said in those ceremonies, those promises that were made, we talk about, even in the treaties, a lot of that is written. So I can always tell if somebody's read the treaties by how they frame it to start with, because almost all of the treaties start about, as long as the grass grows, the sun shines. And I just know people haven't even bothered reading them if they say that kind of thing to me. And I also know they haven't looked into their local indigenous nations intention when they signed it, because there is always a history from our side. And when people haven't researched it, when they don't know it, then I know they don't know what they're talking about. So when they dismiss those treaties without even researching it, that's just their white supremacy racism speaking, number one, right? They don't know what they're talking about, because our elders were very clear, and a lot of that is written. It's just ignored by Canadians. So that's what I
So
say.
excuse my dumbassery for a second, because I am trying to interpret this a certain way, because these treaties clearly mean something very different depending on who was at the ceremony. For the natives that signed these treaties and then they go home, for them, it was something very spiritual, something that means a lot. But for the
Well,
white
and we
people
have
that,
oral ways of knowing, right? Like, so,
Mhm.
um, if we did our traditional ways, I would go home tonight and tell my family I had this wonderful conversation with this white guy, and we talked about the way things could be, and we talked about our the ways that we used to do it. We talked about treaties, and we talked about the importance of land acknowledgements. But when you go to your viewers and you talk to them, it was like, yeah, I talked to this Indian, and she was on there, and she said some pretty cool shit. Like, we've already had two completely different conversations about this, right?
yeah.
Right. So, like, that's kind of that, you know we have two sides to this.
Well,
So
yeah, but like, no, I'm a little bit confused here, because if the government wrote these treaties with the intention of never honoring them and really hurting the people
yeah,
who
no,
were,
I'll tell you that here. So
yeah,
let's stop you right there. This is like part of my land acknowledgement training.
mhm,
So the Indian Act was written and made law in 1876. So when they signed Treaty 7 in 1877, that was a year later, and they already determined things in the Indian Act that they never said at treaty. So we know they already broke treaty before even telling us what was written. And if you were to read Treaty 7, it is colonial and discussing. But if you go down to Blackfoot Crossing, where it was signed, and where they talk about what, like, this was all written by our people, and it was written by not just the Blackfoot, but by all the Treaty 7 members. And what we were told is consistent, but what Canadian law wrote is not.
right,
And what's in the Indian Act is not consistent. What's in, like, all of it is wrong. All of it's built on a lie.
yeah,
So, like, honestly, your history shows you're liars. And that's why it's so important that we understand that history. Because if you're already determined that everything that has been done is a lie, then your entire construct of a society is built on a lie. So your
yeah,
economy is a lie. Everything's a lie.
oh yeah.
And we can just start from basics again and be like, okay, let's do this again.
So would you say that when it comes to the treaties themselves, it's simply a matter of honoring what the indigenous people that showed up to those signings wanted, like what the
Yes.
treaties themselves say that were
Yep.
written by those government officials or whatever.
Yeah, but
That
if you read them, if you actually read them, half of it's really good shit.
half of it's good stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and most Canadians don't know it because they don't bother reading it because they've never been told to, because that's not what they were taught in school. Because they were taught that in school in order to become a good little worker that will just do what they said and make little bombs and stuff so we can go kill native people over in Palestine. You know, like
Oh God, yeah.
Canada needs to deconstruct their thinking.
Would you say that because we are socially ingrained from a young age with racist ways of looking at the world, even people who with the best intentions, right? So my biggest fear, which I do agree, Canadians should read these treaties. I should, everyone should, wherever they are in Canada. But the thing is, it's like, because people have these things in their head that they haven't socially deconstructed it, or it takes a lifetime to socially deconstruct this stuff. When they read these treaties, like you said, there is good shit in there that does benefit the native people who signed it and make sure everyone's good. But there also is language written there that's confusing and vague and benefits the government and stuff like that. And
Yeah.
because it takes a long time to deconstruct that stuff, people who read them won't be able to understand the difference between language that benefits the people who signed it versus the people who drafted it for their own benefit. And that could lead to Canadians getting confused and saying, well, what are you guys going on about? This treaty looks fine, when in reality, they don't know how bad a certain part of it may be.
Yeah, no, they wouldn't. And then, like, Canada today says we stand for human rights. And that's why, we have rhetoric for Israel, we have rhetoric for the Ukraine, but we know it's all bullshit and a lie based
Yep.
off of like the Indian Act. Like the Canadian Constitution has the Indian Act embedded in it, literally based on racism and a lie, right?
Yeah.
Like we weren't at the table for that. So, the UN, we give solutions. We gave solutions with the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, give solution with the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and now the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Inquiry. Like we have guidelines on how to solve this. So honestly, when non-natives try to talk to me about these issues, and I know they haven't read any of these things, I know they're full of shit. They don't really want solutions. They just want change to benefit them without doing their homework.
Yeah, you're right. Your words ring true. I'll admit, I haven't researched the treaties for the area I live in, and I admit that a lot of people haven't actually. I could probably talk to most of my neighbors and not find a single one who's read it. It's not an excuse. It's just a fact of life that most of us are trained to just not consider treaties. We're trained from a young age. It's like, you got to get your driver's license. You got to know what your rights are. You got to go to school. You got to do this. But no one ever says you got to read the treaties of the people of the land that you're standing on. Nobody ever says that because it benefits certain people over others.
Yeah.
And going back to your point of like knowing someone's origin so that you and your family and your friends can feel safe. One of the things I want to nip in the bud, because I know there's going to be people who think this, one of the things I want to nip in the bud is there are people who will call that reverse racism. It's not a thing. People need to stop pretending that it is. It's a huge, huge difference. White people are scared of black and brown people because they've been trained to, because it benefits the ruling class. Natives
Right.
and black and indigenous people are scared of white people because they have reason to be, because of all the genocides and killings and everything that has been perpetrated against.
Plus, plus today, like we are forced to live in a white society, and every single day, white people perpetrate racism on us with
Yeah,
microaggressions or worse, all the time. So, like,
yeah,
we have modern day traumas just as we do historical ones.
yeah. Whether it be, say, someone in a pickup truck yelling the SQ word at a native woman on the sidewalk, whether it be something as overt as that,
Yeah.
or say, you know, something that's very subtle, like somebody, like if you walk into a liquor store or something like that, and the clerk is just staring at you and follows you around a lot, and they're like, oh, I'm just checking, but it's like, I know they know what you're following them for.
Yeah.
Um, these
But
things are
and it's bigger than that too, in the sense that I know every single day that my voice doesn't matter as much as any other voice. So a native man's voice matters more, a black man's voice matters more, a white man's voice matters more, a white woman's voice matters more, and it's even in the algorithms in our social medias, for God's sakes, right?
yeah,
Like
it
it's
is.
that strong, it's that predominant, and
Oh,
like it's going to a church, it's going to a anywhere, going to school, and knowing your voice doesn't count as much, right? Like I'm sure you're well aware of what Ontario or out in Ottawa, what they just did to those kids.
oh my God.
Yeah. So like
Yeah.
it's again, youth voices don't matter, right? So and that's what the Black Lives Matter movement was about as well. Was talking about all of these like constant microaggressions that happen to us no matter
Oh
where
yeah.
we are. So, and like, for example, like this is ridiculous, but yesterday I was unpacking some racism with my husband. And so I have long COVID and I was trying to find the support groups. And because Canadians are so fucking stupid about their own fucking system, they don't know that under the Indian Act, my health jurisdiction is like multi jurisdictional, right? Like all the different orders of government. So, of course, those become barriers to healthcare. And because we have a long history of, Indian hospitals and sterilizations and racism in healthcare, and we have a whole health section in TRC that was never implemented. I face racism trying to get regular care every single moment of every existing day. This is things that white Canadians don't face, right? So like there's so much to unpack with all of this. And these are just like that was just yesterday. That wasn't including the political campaigning issues I had. I had a white woman bust into tears because I said I didn't say it nice enough in her opinion. But that's that white supremacy again coming through so clearly that there's no nice way a black woman or a native woman can say anything when there's a power dynamic of a white woman. And you can never
Yeah.
fully trust a white woman. And I want to. I thought I could, but I learned yesterday one, she wasn't my friend, and two, I still can't trust being around white women.
It's really weird what is defined as white, right? Because it's a racial concept that hasn't even existed for a millennia. It's existed for I think 600-700 years, and these labels for black, brown, white, whatever, they were created for the sole purpose of segregating us. And that's not to say that people didn't have social constructs before the invention of modern race that divided people. It's just that race as we know it was perfected by the European rulers and the colonizers in such a way to really up the ante in terms of separating and hurting people. Now, in terms of origin, like my mother is an immigrant from Turkey. She moved here when she was 13, 14 years old. And Turkey is a predominantly Muslim nation. So I've been around a lot of Muslim women and men in my life. My father is the child of two Greek immigrants who came to Canada after World War II, and the Civil War had completely decimated Greece and they needed a home. So they came to Canada. And while I am white, that's not it's kind of obvious at this point. But what I always found weird throughout my life is that when people talk about whiteness, when I hear white people in Canada talking about whiteness, they always talk about it in a very different way. Like none of them will say stuff like, "Oh, my family's half Greek, half Turkish. My family's Polish. My family's Irish. My family has this in origin." Their culture and identity all seems to revolve around the fact that they're white and grew up in a very specific part of Canada, and it's very divorced from any cultural roots that their family may have had in Europe. It's like I would want to tell people, it's like when I have to tell people that, like, I'm a white person, as opposed to that person who's a black person, that person's a native person. These labels always feel so weird because when you grow up around a certain culture, like Greeks and Turks, crazy people, you want to be able to tell people that. You want to be able to tell, like, yeah,
And that's what I'd like you to. I
yeah,
know for me, that's what I want to hear. Because again, that it comes back to that pride. Like my husband's parents and my parents on my dad's side both mixed up whether or not they were Irish and Scottish. That's a pretty big mistake, don't you think?
Yeah,
Right?
it's pretty big.
That's a
That's
pretty big mistake.
yeah.
Why? Why is that? It comes down to whiteness, right? And being a proud, loyal servant of the crown.
Yeah, a proud, loyal servant of the. What does that even mean? The crown doesn't even know you exist. For anyone out there who calls themselves like a monarcho enthusiast or something like that, or somebody who enjoys, the patriotic aspect of liking the crown, it's like, why? They don't know you exist. The Queen doesn't know you exist. Britain doesn't give a shit about you. It means absolutely nothing.
Yep.
Whereas the people who do give a shit about you are to your left and to your right. But we
Yep.
refuse to acknowledge those people. The Indigenous people, if anyone, give a shit about people in Canada more than the Canadian government, more than the crown, more than our colonial rulers. But we just don't want to acknowledge them, and we turn the other way. And it's really, really depressing to know about. And well, a lot of the issues that we've talked around tonight, because we have like around 15 minutes left, a lot of the issues we talk about tonight, any Indigenous issue, really, like anything that's related to the Indigenous struggle, a lot of it can be fixed with, or begun to be fixed with education. That process starts at education. And I don't mean the formal way of education where it's like, you go to school 5 out of 7 days a week and you take your no, education is a continual process. Whenever you're learning something, you're being educated. It doesn't matter if you're paying for it. It doesn't matter if you're in a college or in a school or whatever, in your own home. You're learning something, you're being educated. Now, my best friend radicalized me, Valerie. She's a trans woman who grew up in, I believe it was Brampton. And she has been my best friend for a large portion of like since high school all the way to now. She's always been like way smarter than me, and I've admired her for her, her knowledge and her skill and her talent. She comes from an Italian family, and being someone who likes to eat Greek food, Italian food is like just as good, and she's also a really good cook. She's currently in university all the way in Nova Scotia, and she wants to be a historian, but she's also taking a side course in Indigenous studies, and she's basically going to get multiple different degrees, right? She's going to get one in Native studies, she wants to get one in history, she's going to be in school for a long time, right? And she tells me a lot about the stuff that she learns in class, in Indigenous studies, in history. And she comes back, and almost every other month she goes, a lot of the things I'm learning, I'm paying people thousands of dollars to teach. I'm paying people thousands of dollars to learn about the Native people who were in my area when, colonization began. I'm paying people thousands of dollars to teach me about the land that I live on. I'm paying people thousands of dollars to learn things that I should have been taught from the very first day of first grade, not even first grade, kindergarten. And she goes, if everybody in Canada received this very same education that seems basic, it's like, all these things you and I talked about can be talked about from a young age. And the difference it would make in one generation would be astronomical. She goes, we make people pay thousands of dollars to learn about stuff that should be for free, that would benefit not just the Native people, but everyone in this whole nation. And she felt bad about it. She said, the fact that I have to go to university in another province to learn about something that should have been taught to me from day one is very sad, but it's also very hopeful, because she wanted the course in Indigenous studies because she's a political activist. She's a Marxist, just like me. In fact, she's the one who converted me to this. But she wants to learn basically everything. She wants to learn, she wants to have every single aspect of everyone's struggle stored away so that she can do her best to help the people around her. She's a person I look up to a lot for those reasons. But she made the point of if the education to fix these things is this, and it's not rocket science, it's very simple discussions that anybody can have with Indigenous representatives and Indigenous people. The fact that it's so easy to have these conversations shows a lot of optimism. It shows that these issues can be fixed, that we can make a lot of progress. And if we just went around Canada and doubled, tripled, quadrupled our efforts, not just the Indigenous people who've already been giving 110%, but the people who claim to support them. If the people who claim to support them actually did this stuff, we would have a better society in less than a generation. And I think that does resonate a lot. I don't know how you personally feel about the educational institutions teaching about Indigenous issues, but I'm going to go ahead and let you speak because I've been rambling on for a little too long.
Oh gosh, no. Well, first of all, I love hearing credit given to where credit is due. So to me, whoever your friend is who's transgender and teaching you all about Marxist theory and trying to, better themselves in learning about the history of this land, like to me, their points are solid, and I couldn't agree more with you. And I want to start there because there's nothing more upsetting than folks who I know listen to my podcast and regurgitate some of the things I say, but clearly don't live it or understand it, right? So to me, I think it's really important that you credit the people that you've learned from. Um, in our ways, that's how way we would do it. So our education is on the land with our elders and with our people. And as we do different tasks, we learn from them, and they tell us those stories of who that taught them. And that's not what we do in colonial Canadian society, right? I've been through the school system, you've been through the school system. We read a textbook, and as we're finding out now, those textbooks are political, very political, especially here in Alberta. So for folks who don't know, our very ultra right-wing conservative leader, who happened to be an activist that prevented LGBTQ2 plus from dying with their partner in San Francisco hospitals during the AIDS crisis. His brother is a conversion therapy proponent. This man absolutely is a right-wing Republican if you're from the States. And a lot of our Canadian conservative elected officials and team go down to the States into Christian evangelical Republican camps so that they can, get a whole team of people to think and act like them. So as a result, they want to completely erase any Indigenous education. So in Canada, we've had so much of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission 94 calls to action be a part of the dialogue. And our Prime Minister is working really hard at trying to implement some of those things as best as a neoliberal can. So not much, right?
Yeah, by neoliberal standards.
Exactly. So we have no real advocate at the table when it comes to these issues. So anyway, back to curriculum. Ironically, if we lived equally and non-natives wanted to learn Indigenous ways, I know our elders would teach them on the land, just as they would teach me, just as they would teach my child. So, if you truly want to live sustainably and you want to have a sustainable economy, and you allow Indigenous people to do those teachings of what we've traditionally done for thousands of years in order to make this the Garden of Eden that these so-called Christians claim they want, we could do that still. And with this conversation of climate change, there is a high possibility we could do more integration there. So when it comes to curriculum, imagine if you learned half of Indigenous knowledge that we would be willing to share in order to create a sustainable world. Because at the end of the day, our loyalty isn't to Canada. It's to the next generations. It's to the 7 generations. And if white people are going to be here for 7 generations with our kids, then this is how you do it. It's not. It's the most selfless thing I can possibly explain.
Thing is, it's like, as beautiful as that is, a lot of people get very discouraged because they'll learn about all these things and they'll have these tough conversations and they'll go out into the world and be like, yeah, this is what we've got to do. But then, we have our elections every 4 or 5 years. They change it every so often. I don't know when they call it. But, in every single election, despite the fact that we know that both parties serve the same masters, all the conservative areas stay conservative and all the liberal areas stay liberal, and people lose faith because they're like, why do we keep electing these guys and pretending that we stand for indigenous issues and stuff? And while I'm not excusing anybody who continues to elect bigots into power and people who do nothing, what we need to understand is less and less people have faith in politics now than they ever have. They have less faith now because even if we're like, 33% of people elected Kenny, 22% voted Liberal, 20% voted NDP, that's not percentage of, say, all Albertans. That's the percentage of Albertans that bothered to show up to the polls because they have some faith in the electoral process. And the majority of people are losing faith in the electoral process. But we look at the election polls and because the media loves this, they like making it look like, you see, everyone's still on board with the same old people, and it discourages us from, going out there and continuing to talk about this kind of stuff. But where the difference is between Indigenous people and the white people who get discouraged about this kind of stuff, I want to reemphasize, don't get discouraged because of, one, the reason I mentioned just a couple minutes ago, where it's like, it's all manipulation. And two, we can't afford to get discouraged because the Indigenous people have been fighting for this stuff since the first day this land was colonized and stuff. They have no choice. They can't give up because their lives are on the line. Their land is on the line. Their families are on the line. Their way of life is on the line. What's on the line for us? Like, oh, wow, we feel bad about ourselves? No, keep going back out there. Double, triple, quadruple your efforts. And I'll admit, I've had days where I get pretty discouraged every time I see an election poll. And I'm like, this guy fucking sucks. Why do you people still vote for him? But then I'm reminded I'm just being showed the small group of idiots that keep voting for this guy compared to the overwhelming majority of working class people who see this guy for the clown that he really is. But I'm told to think that, no one cares about what you want. Bull.
You know what? That's really the power, though, of podcasts and the media. Like, you and I grew up in a time where CBC controlled the narrative. And because we had so much U.S. news, I knew more about Americans than I did Canadians. That's the bottom line, is now that we have a lot more, streaming services and ability to talk to each other, we actually do have the ability to organize more. And I know Idle No More, we were organizing internationally because of Facebook, right? So, like, never give up, because we can do way more than we've ever been able to do before because of this technology, to be able to connect with each other without government interference of determining whether or not we can have a podcast.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And, well, one other point I wanted to bring up very early in the beginning, but I never did. There are, as stupid as this sounds, legitimately people think that giving control, or not even control, just sovereignty to Indigenous people in general will lead to technological decline. And I want to address the fact that it's like, because they are convinced of like, oh, the colonization and stuff was bad, but all that led to industry, which led to like all the technology we have now. And I just want to say, innovation doesn't have to come at the cost of morals and ethics and human lives. And also, societies continue to advance regardless. Nobody stays stuck in one place. It's just different people go at different paces, right? And by that logic, it's like, oh, if we go back to if we listen to the Indigenous people, everything will be primitive. The ancient Greeks didn't have iPhones or industry or steam-powered machines, and yet they were pretty okay. And
okay, let's just stop for 1 second, because like at the end of the day, it comes down to racism again.
Yeah.
And the reason why is because, for example, white people didn't shower, and they brought diseases as a result of it.
Yeah.
It was our people who taught them to bathe daily in order to be clean, in order to not spread disease.
They also had,
and ironically, like that's the problem with this belief system of we're better and we brought the best, because that did not happen. They brought the worst. They brought germicidal warfare. they brought that until we taught them to clean themselves.
Yeah.
Um, so, but back to that idea, like, we can do ethical economy where people live equally. What a lot of white supremacist workers think is that, it's okay for Elon Musk to make billions of dollars at the expense of indigenous lives. Imagine if we didn't have Elon Musk making billions of dollars and indigenous lives weren't being killed globally in order for a cell phone.
Yeah.
We can do it more sustainably and in a way that's more ethical. But
Yeah.
we have to decide that before we go and do it. And we haven't done that. We've just decided it's okay for Elon Musk or the Queen to make billions of dollars at our lives. And until that framework stops, who's more primitive? Because it was, the colonizers that came here and smashed our babies up against trees. You tell me who's more savage. It was actually the colonizers that had the head tax, where if you brought the scalp, they got paid for Indian scalps. So every lie you think of natives needs to be unpacked. So
Hmm.
before people give stupid, shitty, racist opinions exposing their racism, they should really sit and determine, is it really, like, if you're going to say the words, they're so savage, unpack that, right?
Yeah.
If we're primitive, unpack that, because we were living here for thousands of years sustainably. So what lies have you been told that you feel comfortable with, the media that you've been told, the curriculum that you've been given, that you feel comfortable even saying that?
Yeah. It's when you really break it down and learn about this stuff, because like you said, it's like it's all white people to bathe because it turns out bathing is something that people need to be taught to do. And as I recall, the people who set foot on North America had scurvy. And it was the natives that said, "Hey, drink this and don't get scurvy, you idiots. Like, just
Yeah.
just bring some dried fruit with you or whatever."
But bring that back even further, because to the queen, their lives were dispensable. It was cheaper for people to die, same with slaves, than it was to give them, like, vitamin C. So
Yeah.
even their belief system comes down from like a colonial truth that they don't want to unpack.
They don't. They don't because it would be against their interests.
Yep.
Um, we are trained from a young age to associate technological advancement, industries, and humanities' achievements with capitalism. And we are taught by proxy to accept and almost embrace the exploitative, murderous nature of the capitalist system, of the remnants of the colonizers' like pillars. We are taught that it's all necessary, and we're given the impression that's like, yeah, all this stuff was bad, but look at the stuff we have now. But indigenous societies were no more advanced than the European societies that set foot on their shores. They were just different. That's it.
Well, actually, I would argue, I'd push back on that. So, for example, we have wheels here that measure, the space. We have more science behind astronomy than white people ever had. And ironically, like a farmer owning a plot of land, being able to destroy a wheel that's been thousands of years old, measuring different space phenomenon, is easily done today. Like, we have to fight to save that wheel. Thousands of years of history and science of astronomy in one piece that white people just are okay with destroying in a second.
Where is this wheel?
Just here in Alberta, just outside of Calgary here. So,
Where can
and
it be?
that's not including the ones they've already destroyed. So,
Where can it be found?
oh, if you just Google these things, you will find them. You will absolutely find them. So, like, it's not from a lack of it not being available. It's from a lack of folks knowing it's there.
Right. Okay. I'll look up that a little bit later. We
Sure.
are running out of time a little bit, but I am willing to make a little bit extensions here and there when we have these important conversations.
Sure.
Thing is, it's like, okay, yeah, going back to the point of advancement, you're right. In a lot of areas, indigenous societies were more advanced than the people that came and colonized them in the first place. All of these things are very relative, and we don't want to see it that way, right? And we judge people by because we have images in our heads when we think of indigenous societies. And because of the way that we're brought up, we don't think like, oh, I don't associate that with astronomy. I don't associate that with science. I don't associate that with math. But this is all when we take a second to, think about these things, it falls apart because, like I said, being someone who I have Greeks in my family. I'm taught that a bunch of guys in white robes and togas and sandals were able to chart out the stars. And then I'm told by white people over here that, like, oh, yeah, you see these natives over here? Yeah, they never would be able to achieve these achievements. I'm like, what the hell are you talking about? They had more to work with than the Greeks did, and they managed to do so much more. And not only that, but a lot of the achievements of First Nations people are just forgotten about and relegated to just, fun facts that you may find on a website or on a video here and there, not something that is widely taught about. We're taught about Thomas Edison inventing the light bulb from the time that we're 7. But Indigenous people coming up with the cure for scurvy? No. Telling people to bathe? No. Charting out the stars? No. None of that. Those are all fun facts. But a guy stealing an invention from another guy, that's something we all get talked about from a young age. But yeah, you said it's why we have these podcasts. It's why we have the internet. It's why we're able to amplify our voices and amplify each other's voices. It's why we keep doing this. Right? So even if it seems hopeless, we're able to subvert the system every day, every time we have conversations like this.
Yes. And, like solidarity for the Amazon Union, there's another example of, they're trying so hard to silence him. Here's Jeff Bezos with $1 billion, and some black guy who got fired is still doing the work.
He got fired.
We underestimate the amount of power we have as individuals and then as a collective. So Jeff Bezos doesn't need to make billions of dollars. He really doesn't. And the sooner people get that through their heads, the sooner we can, start a more sustainable economy.
No one should have that amount of money. It is funny when you think about it, because that guy spoke up about, bad workplace and bad payment and all this stuff, got fired, and then came back and became the leader of Amazon's first union. If that's not a success story, 10 times the success story, 100 times the success story that Jeff Bezos claims he has, I don't know what is. And
right?
Yeah, I want to end off this episode on something that a lot of people I know are going to be afraid to confront, but we should confront it anyway because there's no harm in doing it. Now, every one of us in this society, in Canada, I'm just going to use Canada as an example because we're Canadian law. Every one of us who is not Indigenous, we're taught and we're raised and educated a very specific way that benefits the people that hurt all of us over the people who want to help us. And the Indigenous people have been nothing but the best for the people who live in Canada and call themselves Canadian. And they not only get mistreated, but they get no credit for it. And in order for all of this to be done, and if anyone's wondering, like, we need political action, we need direct action, we need to destroy the people who are trying to hurt the Indigenous people, we need to undo all this damage, and like you get a whirl of emotions in your head, understand that the very first thing that needs to be done is for all of us to look inside ourselves and deconstruct our own thoughts, our own mindsets, and ask ourselves the tough questions. Because as tough as it may seem, as hard as it may seem to acknowledge, maybe I haven't been looking at this in the best way, maybe I've been like feeding into a certain narrative that's racist, maybe this, maybe that, as hard as that is to come to terms with, it was 1,000 million times harder for Indigenous people to go through the things that led to the society that created someone who can think like that in the first place. And we have to stop being so adverse to being uncomfortable, because the sooner we do it and actually move forward with it, the better we can feel. And the actual hope that we can feel from doing this stuff it will feel so much better, and it will feel worth looking inside yourself and addressing it. I'll be the first. I'm not the first to admit it, but like as a figure of saying, I'll admit it. I have it. My parents have it. All my friends have it. Everyone who is not Indigenous has it. We all have to do it. We all have a duty to do it, and it's going to take a lifetime to do it. But it's because of people like this that we have to do it. Michelle, I'm very grateful that you were able to come on today. You were honestly a joy, and I look forward to working with you in the future if you'd be open to that.
Oh, heck yeah. No, to me, the more people are willing to learn, I mean, I have a free book club that's national. If you're in Canada, I'd open up to Americans if you're listening. It's been ongoing. You can go to my podcast and my YouTube channel and see the old ones. You can start somewhere, and you can start today. It's not just my voice. There's so many Indigenous voices out there. There's podcasts. There's books out there. We do movies, all sorts of stuff. It's not from a lack of it being out there. So, and now we have, some major leaders. In fact, our Governor General is a Nook, and I'm quite proud of that because we put forward a policy through the Liberal Party that actually failed, and ironically now is happening. So once you place the right idea in the right head, before you know it, Langevin block has changed, right? So we're not giving credit to another genocidal maniac that was called a founding father, depending on your white supremacist attitude, right?
Well, go ahead and shout yourself out. Tell the people what you got going on, where they can find you, everything about you, because,
Sure.
I want people to know who you are.
So if you're a podcaster or listen to podcasts, there are two apps, depending on whether you're an iTunes user or an iPod user, or whether you're other, whatever you call these smart devices. So, just download the app and then start listening to podcasts. If you're a YouTube person, I'm on YouTube. If you're on social media, I'm on social media. Be careful with my Instagram. I have a second one. The first one got hacked, and even though you have to do a video thing, it didn't work. So please don't white-splain or settler-splain to me how to get my thing back, because you also don't understand algorithms and how they're purposely designed to, not amplify Indigenous women voices. That's why we had a national inquiry on missing and murdered Indigenous women, because of the absolute hate and misogyny against Indigenous women. So you asked me if I'd come back in a second, because it's really important when a white man uses his privilege and power to amplify Indigenous women. And the hope is, too, that you'll find a few Indigenous women closer to your area that you'll have on. So, for example, my friend Naomi Sayers, she's going to be running independently for the Sault Ste. Marie. So if you're out in Ontario, what a wonderful person to have on your podcast or your show to amplify her voice and maybe get some folks to consider throwing a vote that way if they have the ability to be able to. So,
I'd love
any way
to.
that, yeah. So like these are folks that I want to promote, right? Especially in your area, because your area is so target rich with Indigenous voices. And I mean, they are all across the country, but especially for folks who understand media and multimedia, right? Pam Palmater, another strong voice for Indigenous people out east there. So, these are voices that I want to hear, and I listen to shows with them on it, because they are the ones who mentor me and teach me as well. So I just recommend that for everyone. We just had Red Dress Day. And so if you were to Google in your social medias, usually Facebook, Red Dress Day, you'd see who the leaders were that really created that day. And those are the people you want on your show. Those are the people you want to follow and listen as well. But of course, I'm Native Calgarian, and it's to make fun of white people who call themselves Native whatever when they're non-Indigenous. Like, it really just back to the land back, understanding colonialism, explaining who you are. When I hear someone say, "Oh, I'm a Native Calgarian," and I say, "Oh yeah, what nation are you from?" They go, "Oh no, I was born here." I'm like, "Yeah, I know what you meant, but you just told me so many things by saying that to me as a Native woman, that you don't understand land acknowledgement, you don't understand Indigenous issues, and you are okay with appropriation." So, it teaches me so much by a simple expression.
There's a lot of work to be done, and that's why we have people like Michelle. All right. Everybody, go follow Michelle on every platform she just said. Go follow her friends, watch her podcast, everything. I cannot stress that enough. All right. Thank you for coming on tonight, Michelle.
I'm
And
honored. Thank you.
Thank you for everyone who decided to tune in tonight. Good night, everybody. Stay safe.